Well, good morning, good afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. My name is Jeff Klein. I am the director of the Naval Postgraduate School's Wayne P. Hughes Jr. Naval Warfare Studies Institute. And welcome to today's Seapower Conversation. If you're not familiar with the Seapower Conversations, they're informal presentations on and discussions about topics of interest to the 21st century naval warfighters. The Seapower Conversations, and well, like the Institute itself, are a tribute to the late Captain Wayne Hughes Jr., the NPS professor, author of Fleet Tactics, and a mentor to generations of naval officers. If you'd like to learn more about NWSI or become a member, we're an open institute. Please visit www.mps.edu/NWSI, and you'll see our website as well as a little button that says Request Membership. But today we're hosting Mr. Dmitry Filipoff, the editor and director of online content for the well-read Center for International Maritime Security, or CIMSEC. As many of you know, CIMSEC is a community of defense and foreign policy professionals, academics, and enthusiasts dedicated to the safeguarding prosperity on the seas. And many of you I know are part of that community. In addition to being its editor, though, Dmitry contributes thoughtful articles to the discussion himself. Today, we're hosting him to discuss one such series, How the Fleet Forgot to Fight. It's a frank assessment of the U.S. Navy's preparation for future conflict. Before I turn it over to him, I ask that everyone mute their mics. Please enter the questions or comments in the chat, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Our intent for this session is to challenge us in order to strengthen our naval service. With that, Dmitry, give me just a half a minute and I will call up your slides and turn it over to you.
All righty, thank you, Jeff. Thank you to the Naval Warfare Studies Institute and Jeff for having me. This is a great opportunity, and this is a great institute that I'm sure is going to be doing some excellent work going ahead. So I'll just jump straight into it. And also, as a heads up, I like to keep my slides pretty simple and infrequent. So if you find yourself staring at the same slide for a little while, it is by design. So. To get into it, How the Fleet Forgot to Fight was an article series that I published on CIMSEC some time ago, and the series covered many topics, so I'll try to narrow it down and focus on what I feel are some of the more important things. When those two major reviews came out to try to explain why those collisions happened out in the Pacific, one term that got used was normalization of deviation. And this term is the main theme behind this series, that the Navy is suffering from very serious self-inflicted problems and is deviating in many of its most important efforts in how it prepares for conflict. What specifically inspired these articles was writing in proceedings, mainly writing on the new fleet problem exercises by Admiral Scott Swift, who was the Pacific Fleet Commander, and also writing by Captain Dale Relog, who was the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Director, especially an article of his called An Open Letter to the U.S. Navy from Red. These articles helped spark the series because of how they describe the character of the Navy's exercises. And given how important military exercises are, this issue really sheds light on systemic problems throughout the Navy. So when looking into the Navy's exercises, the keywords and themes that kept coming up are things like high kill ratios, training one skill set at a time, ad hoc debriefing, and shallow opposition. And I'm going to briefly go over some of these things. The structure of training certification in Navy usually took the form of focusing on individual skill sets in warfare areas, any surface warfare, any air warfare, and so on. But these things are not often combined in a true multi-domain way. Instead, exercise and training certification regimes often took the form of a linear progression of individual events. The opposition forces are made to behave in such a way as to facilitate these events. However, a more realistic and thinking adversary would probably employ the multi-domain tactics and operations that are the bread and butter of war at sea. But instead, the opposition often acted more as facilitators for simpler target practice, it seems, which is why very high kill ratios were the norm. But more importantly, a steady theme that kept reappearing was that the opposition pretty much never won. Now, there are so many of these events, so many training certifications that had to be earned in order to be considered deployable that sailors feel extremely rushed to get through them. And these severe time pressures help encourage this kind of training, especially at the expense of having a solid after-action review process. By comparison, if you are losing and taking heavy losses, then you should be taking that extra time to do after-action reviews and debriefing to figure out what went wrong and how to do better. The after-action review of a combat training exercise can be a really humbling experience for the warfighting professional, where leaders are forced to take responsibility for mistakes that in real combat would have gotten their people hurt. How a leader accounts for such consequential errors can reveal something about their command philosophy and leadership style. And so the way this kind of after-action conversation plays out is absolutely fundamental to the professional development of the warfighter, and it is an important expression of the culture of the organization. Now, when it comes to debriefing culture within a Navy's communities, you can see a difference in the strike fighter community where candid debriefing and opposition force training is more embedded into how they do business. But I'd say the opposite was very much true of the surface Navy system. And what is being described here also applies more broadly to how things were done for larger groups of ships, such as at the strike group level. But overall, the Navy's major exercises often took a scripted character, where the outcomes were generally known beforehand and the opposition was usually made to lose. Training only one thing at a time against opposition that never wins barely scratches the surface of war, but for the most part, this was the best the Navy could do to train its strike groups for years. So is this common? It looks like all the services have some history of doing heavily scripted combat exercises, but there is a major difference between what the Navy was doing and what the Air Force and the Army have been doing for a long time. Slide, please. This is a table of kill ratios earned by 4 Armored Brigade combat teams at the Army's National Training Center. And so the Army and the Air Force have high-end combat exercises that they rotate their people through. For the Air Force, this is a major exercise called Red Flag, and for the Army, this happens at the National Training Center. And they compete against opposition that often inflicts heavy losses and employs a variety of assets at the same time. Those forces are composed of units that are dedicated toward acting as full-time opposition for these events, such as the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, where units across the Army rotate through the NTC to face off against them specifically. The job of these standing opposition forces is to learn and practice the doctrine of foreign adversaries and then put that into practice to make for a much more realistic fight. But by comparison, it seems the Navy doesn't have a major multi-domain standing formation to act as full-time opposition for the high-end fight. And when it comes to the Marines, a valuable question was posed by Captain William Bradley. In an article, he asked, "Who among us can say he has been a part of major exercises where success was not artificially preordained?" That article, published 30 years ago. Much more recent writing on how opposition forces were used in the Marine Corps kept referencing something called the die-in-place method. Slide, please. Now, when it comes to the Chinese Navy, those public reports that the Office of Naval Intelligence puts out on foreign militaries paint a very different picture from what the US Navy was doing. The Chinese Navy often trains multiple skill sets at a time. They do not always know the composition and the disposition of the forces they are facing off against, and they do not always know exactly what will happen when the event is about to go down. They've been training like this for some time now, and with a specific institutional focus on high-end warfighting at the very same time, the US Navy was focusing on the low-end spectrum of operations. And this is a disparity worth highlighting because it can have strategic consequences. For years, the US Navy has not tried to practice destroying modern fleets, but the Chinese Navy has. Recently, there have been some positive changes for the US Navy. There are the fleet problem exercises Admiral Swift started, which seem to be the first consistent and truly challenging large-scale, high-end exercise events the Navy has had in a long time. The Comp-2X exercise ships due before deploying is becoming more difficult, especially through LVC or live virtual and constructive training. The surface Navy is going through these new SWAT exercises, which are now some of the most advanced events surface ships experience. The submarine force has stood up a new aggressor squadron, and there have been some similar changes for the Marines. But what all of these changes have in common is that they only really started within the past few years. The extent to which the Navy will really make the most of them is unclear. But what is clear is that the corporate memory of the fleet, the institution of the modern US Navy, has been heavily shaped by decades of these pretty straightforward combat exercises. Slide, please. And exercises go far beyond training. At the tactical level, they are the one activity that comes closest to real war. So exercises are supposed to play a vital function in setting a standard and serving as proving grounds for all kinds of concepts, ideas, and capabilities. This goes to the very heart of one of the most important missions of a peacetime military, which is to develop the force for future conflict. So the Navy's decades-long exercise shortfall is far more than an issue of operator skill. It is a sweeping developmental problem. So consider how you could go about exploring a new tactic, a war game, or warfighting concept. You come up with an idea and refine it as much as possible through simulations or other methods. And then you finally try it out in the real world through an exercise. You make sure to use serious opposition to see where things may go wrong or backfire. You then rinse and repeat until you have a sturdy, resilient concept. And once you have that, you convert lessons learned in experimentation into new training. You update the training events, and then you rotate your people through those events so they have a chance to learn and apply the new thing. But this is not how force development worked in the US Navy. When it comes to at-sea experimentation, relatively few warfighting ideas were ever tried out in the real world to begin with. But if an idea managed to get tested in some sort of combat exercise, it often went up against heavily scripted opposition. As a result, it had few, if any, rounds of trial and error. But if they moved on in spite of that, the idea was perhaps turned into some publication that was then tucked away in a lessons learned library somewhere. And there it will sit among many other publications that hardly anyone is really familiar with. Now, if they do happen to be familiar with it, they will not often have the chance to actually practice it and learn it in a live combat exercise. And if they do have the chance to actually practice it, it most likely turned into just another check-in-a-box scripted certification event lost among the dozens, if not hundreds of other certifications that are all competing with each other for the time of the extremely busy sailor. And the sailors often have no real choice but to rush through them and frequently cut corners just to make do and get out on time for deployment. Now, it's important to recognize that these scripted exercises and this bloated training certification system overlaid an era of supposed transformation for the Navy, because the power projection era was happening at the very same time as the network-centric era. The Navy promoted supposedly transformative warfighting concepts like ForceNet and air-sea battle, but to the average deck plate sailor, these concepts didn't change much. There just never was much air-sea battle training, network-centric warfighting doctrine, or extensive tactical development for most new major capabilities. Now, the Navy certainly made an effort to transform, but progress can't be measured by how many new capabilities come online, how many new CONOPS or doctrine documents that get published, or war games or simulations that get run. If these things are going to truly come alive, they have to be taught to and refined by the people that will be charged with their execution. So in my mind, at least, when it comes to force development and warfighting, real progress and skill is best defined by what the sailors and commanders on the deck plate know how to do well. And for that, there is only training. So looking back on the Navy's recent history of force development, so much of what the Navy did just didn't go that far. This habit of unrealistic exercising and this overflowing training certification system came together to make so many warfighting concepts untested, unrefined, and untaught. For an important example on why other parts of force development have to be grounded in training, you can look to the Navy's wargaming enterprise. These war games are really important to how the Navy thinks about the future, and among many things, these war games can inform war planning. But if you read more into it, these war games aren't nearly as scripted or as straightforward as the live training and exercise events, and the fleet often takes very serious losses in these war games, especially against China. So what could be the implications of having a large disparity between the realism of training and the realism in wargaming? For one, it means the war plans the United States has drawn up for great power conflict are filled with tactics and operations for which the US Navy has made barely any effort to actually teach to its people. To paraphrase a certain defense secretary, you go to war with the fleet you trained, not the one you wargamed. Another major implication of the exercise shortfall was in how the Navy applied strategy to operations, or what the fleet was spending its time doing on deployment all these years. Because the Navy not only has the chance to work on force development through exercises within the workup cycle, but also when ships are certified and out on deployment. But when ships deployed in the power projection era, their operations mostly focused on missions that didn't contribute all that much to high-end force development. Slide, please. It should be remembered that many of the low-end power projection missions that dominated Navy deployments during these past 2 decades, things like security cooperation, forward presence, maritime security, these things are at first not seen as overriding demand signals for the Navy's time. The strategy and policy documents the Navy was putting out just after the Cold War ended characterized the opportunity to do some of these missions as a luxury, something that was afforded to the Navy only through the demise of a great power rival. Now, when it comes to the major campaigns the U.S. was involved in these past few decades, mainly Iraq and Afghanistan, what needs to be understood is that blue water naval power really struggles to find relevance in these kinds of wars. A destroyer or a submarine just can't do much to fight insurgents or nation build. So for the vast majority of the fleet ships, they usually did other things with their time, including many of these missions that were certainly helpful, but often optional. Many of these operations are better described as the many opportunities that come with a really diverse set of missions you see at the low end spectrum of operations, rather than really pressing requirements driven by wartime demand or geopolitical risk. For just one example, while tens of thousands of soldiers and Marines were solely focused on advising heavily embattled Iraqi and Afghan troops, the Navy enjoyed the luxury of partnering with dozens of other nations, almost all of whom were not engaged in any major hostilities. And it looks like a major driver of the Navy's steadfast commitment to forward presence was to deter Iran in the Gulf, but the Navy can't afford a full-time continuous strike group in the Gulf when it comes to balancing other priorities. The Navy certainly can maintain that requirement if it is going to appropriately resource the development of the force with regular large-scale combat exercises. The Navy also can't maintain that requirement in the Gulf when it's supposed to be beefing up its presence relative to China in the Pacific. When it comes to demand signals for ready naval power, CENTCOM should be several levels below INDOPACOM. The amount of forward presence and surge capacity the Navy needs to orient toward the Indo-Pacific is growing with every single new ship and anti-ship missile the Chinese Navy is fielding. And if you are tracking those numbers, then you know that fleet is growing incredibly fast. And even if there really was an extremely pressing need to maintain this level of presence close to Iran indefinitely, the Navy wouldn't be able to sustain it anyway. The fleet is just too small to make it happen, and all these years of maintenance spiraling out of control reveals a prolonged struggle to come to grips with basic material limits. And so because blue water naval power just cannot do much for counterinsurgency and nation building, and because the threat from Iran should have been balanced with other priorities, if any of the services could have made the time to exercise for force development in the past 20 or so years, it is the Navy. Now, in spite of their own crushing operational tempos, the Army and the Air Force have guaranteed significant amounts of forces for their high-end exercises. Hundreds of aircraft participate in the Air Force's Red Flag exercises each year, and about a third of the Army's active duty brigades visit the National Training Center annually. Slide, please. This is a photo of an Army Stryker brigade massing at the National Training Center. And so the force generation models of these services and the associated combatant commander demand signals have preserved significant amount of forces in readiness for these services to consistently conduct major high-end force development exercises at home. The ready forces of these services are not all exclusively allocated toward feeding COCOM demand. And compared to this, the Navy operates under a different model. It looks like for the past 2 decades, almost all of the ready naval power of the fleet was being spent on what the combatant commanders want. And those demand signals were so overpowering that they made it incredibly difficult for the Navy to pull together enough ready ships to do truly large-scale and high-end exercises on a regular basis. So as the Navy enters this era of great power competition, it needs to look at striking a new balance between allocating ready naval power toward force development versus forward operations. And this should be seen as an opportunity for the Navy to finally reclaim some of the fleet for itself, to devote ready naval power toward working on the Navy's force development agenda and not just what the combatant commanders want. Slide, please. You can look to how the Navy is standing up a surface development squadron that is exclusively focused on experimentation. That is an example of guaranteeing time and ready naval power to be spent on the Navy's force development. You can also look to the upcoming introduction of the annual LSEs, or large-scale exercises, the first of which is planned for this summer. With respect to adjusting that critical relationship between the combatant commands and the Navy, and how ready naval power is allocated between them, these new annual large-scale exercises could mark a sea change. Now, some might say the Navy actually did do a lot for force development on deployment when it was exercising with partners and allies abroad. But there are a couple issues with this. The U.S. Navy does not like sharing even moderately classified information with many partner fleets, and this really limits the willingness of the Navy to fully flex its capability abroad in front of partners. And this also would inhibit the quality of the debriefing you can do and technical follow-through. Another major reason is that there is a severe amount of concern on the Navy's part, perhaps over concern, on being surveilled by competitors when exercising in forward areas, or anywhere, actually. So aside from what looks like maybe a handful of exceptions, most of the exercises the Navy does abroad with partners are maybe even more straightforward than what it does close to home. And so the main point here is that the Navy hardly recognizes force development as a major driver of fleet operations. Things like testing out war games and new warfighting concepts in the real world must be recognized as some of the strongest possible demand signals for ready naval power. So as the Navy reconfigures itself for great power competition, it has to think about how it will strike a new balance between spending time on forward operations versus spending time on working on itself. Slide, please. The fleet can start with the strategic guidance the Navy has to align itself with. There is a national defense strategy that makes great power competition the main priority. So what does the Navy need to learn about for great power competition? A large part of that is spending more time getting ready for high-end warfighting. Now, it's not the only thing in great power competition, but it clearly warrants more focus compared to what it received in the previous generation. And so the Navy needs to identify what specific operations have the most learning value when it comes to getting better at that specific problem set. Look at the learning value of fleet battle problem or a SWAT exercise and compare it to maritime security missions or doing security cooperation with a third world partner. It should become pretty clear that these exercise events can teach the Navy far more about high-end warfighting than almost all forward operations. And now I want to paraphrase something that I read from an admiral who was a submarine force commander a couple years back. In a news article, he said something along the lines of, we're taking a really hard look and in-depth scrub of our certification process to insert 10 days worth of force-on-force training for the high-end fight. Only 10 days worth. And this points to something important about the Navy when it comes to trying to do more of these unscripted force-on-force exercises. Why was it so difficult for the Navy to make so little time for one of the most important things it has to be doing? Whether it's cutting certifications to make time for more thorough events within the workup cycle or retasking ships on deployment, it's often been a tough bureaucratic fight to make space for these things. And this problem suggests that the Navy has gone for so long without in-depth force development exercises that the need for them turned into a blind spot, and it didn't realize why it is such a big deal that it is missing out on these things and why it is so fundamental to the well-being of the force. And so if there's not that much experience in doing this kind of thing, then there will not be that many advocates. And so what the Navy has been doing with its time and its budgets and its forces for so many years was stretched to its limits in the absence of a major demand signal. And that demand signal is something I really want to hone in on. I want to try and describe a framework for why force development is a major demand signal for ready naval power. And I also want to try to describe the nature of failing to account for force development risk. And so there are at least two elements that can drive this demand signal and increase force development risk. One is the force development of competitors, and the other is the nature of disruptive capability surprise. Slide, please. Looking at China, it is critical to understand that the Chinese military is primarily focused on its force development. They also have no significant overseas operations that draw their attention elsewhere. And because of that, the operating posture of their fleet has far more in common with the interwar period US Navy than the modern US Navy does. And this can make them pretty dangerous because, like the interwar period US Navy, that would of course go on to help win World War II, their operating posture allows them to spend most of their time on working on themselves for the high-end fight. Going to a second major demand signal of force development, that is guarding against disruptive capability surprise. Slide, please. So look at World War I, the machine gun, the trench, big gun artillery. When they finally put all these new things together, it created a type of warfare that nobody had really seen before. New technology had changed the nature of tactical success so much, but their peacetime force development failed to detect that. The disruption that came from those new weapons and the tactics they produced was so powerful it helped rip apart the operational and strategic plans of nations caught in great power war. And of course, there was a tremendous human cost in failing to detect these new tactical trends. So how do you get a sense of that burden today, of how much real-world combat experimentation needs to go into modern high-end force development? And how much latent force development risk could be out there? Slide, please. Look to how networked combat between great powers has never happened before, or how fleet combat between great powers hasn't happened since World War II. And look at everything that's evolved since then. electronic warfare, cyber, missiles, satellites. So much has changed. But our ability to truly know how all of that will actually come together to produce specific tactical dynamics and winning combinations is very hard to know for sure. A lot of these questions are already being looked at by organizations within the Navy, but the furthest the analysis is able to go is often limited by simulations. Some time ago, we published an excellent piece on CIMSEC where people from the Naval Postgraduate School, mainly wargamers and operations research folks, talked about doing tens of thousands of simulations and models to look at tactics and concepts for a new unmanned ship. Those kinds of people certainly learn a lot about new tactics, but I imagine they will tell you that they could benefit from a lot more real-world experimentation. And I also imagine they would want some of their insights to eventually be passed on to the deck plate sailor through upgraded training. Now, when it comes to force development, clearly you want to enter a conflict with the most tried and true concepts and capabilities. But it's almost inevitable that when you finally get into a real high-end fight, something is going to break. So I want to use another example to show how force development risk reveals itself in wartime. Slide, please. The U.S. submarine force entered World War II with ill-conceived concepts of operation, a highly risk-averse culture, faulty weapons, and underdeveloped tactics. Submariners at first expected to mostly use sonar to attack their targets, which didn't really make sense with the technology at the time. The torpedoes didn't work well, and they didn't have much doctrine for unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, this force development failure happened in spite of interwar period wargaming, fleet problem exercises, and Admirals Nimitz and King both having a decent amount of submarine experience in their careers. U.S. naval commanders even had the benefit of watching German U-boats earn combat experience as they sunk plenty of ships in the Atlantic before the U.S. entered the war. But in spite of all of that, the U.S. submarine force punched far below its weight for many months while the rest of the force depended very heavily on them to take the fight to enemy home waters at the start of the conflict. The submarine force would go on to fix these problems, but they were forced to experiment with their force development in the middle of the war. And this points to something important as to why you should really try to get your force development right in peacetime. The better you do in peacetime, the more you will be able to focus your wartime force development on proactive evolution instead of retroactive corrective action. You would rather be taking those hard-earned combat lessons and using them to make the next best torpedo, rather than trying to figure out what's going wrong with the ones you already have. And so if these force development shortfalls are worth taking the time to fix in the middle of a war, then surely they are worth taking the time to fix today in relative peacetime. But coming back to the present, it is hard to say just how many unhelpful things have made it into the modern U.S. Navy, simply because large-scale, unscripted, high-end force development exercises were not there to serve as proving grounds or set a standard. While the Navy was working to mitigate geopolitical risk through forward operations, the force development risk that resides within the Navy has been building and building. The Navy's system of trying things out in the real world has almost certainly primed the fleet for a lot of hard corrective action in the event of great power conflict. And so imagine how this could play out. Imagine there was a new major concept of operations in the works, and it was lucky enough to get the Navy to devote a single large-scale exercise to trying it out. And after that one exercise, it got the stamp of approval and then was filed away in some lessons learned system. And now imagine a conflict breaks out and a strike group commander needs that concept. And when he sees it, it's the first time he's ever really looked at it. He's never really tried it out. And he's pretty sure nobody under his command has been trained to do it. And he can't even be sure that the concept itself was the product of a rigorous series of at-sea combat trials. Now, how much risk do you think that has? The Navy has plenty of things like this residing within itself. And so it's safe to say that if a major conflict breaks out tomorrow, from the very start, a lot of people in the Navy will be forced to improvise. And by its very nature, the skill of improvisation is just about the furthest thing heavily scripted training is able to teach. Now, taking a longer strategic view, after the Soviet Union fell, the Navy could have taken a different path rather than pivoting all the way to power projection. This sort of awkward mismatch between blue water naval power for counterinsurgency could have actually been a blessing in disguise for the Navy, while the other services are heavily tied down by operations in the Middle East. The Navy could have instead focused on settling complex developmental questions posed by emerging network-centric concepts and capabilities. But the Navy effectively missed a historic opportunity to make major progress on force development, where the fleet could have focused on securing its future edge. Instead, it let a rising rival close the gap. For a generation now, the Chinese and the US navies have focused their skills and their training and their culture on opposite ends of the warfighting spectrum. And this disparity can be far more fatal to the American fleet. A superpower navy does not threaten its existence by lacking low-end skills, but it can certainly risk destruction by not being ready for the high-end fight. This is why full spectrum competence across the range of operations is so indispensable, and it can't be ignored for a superpower fleet. Now, a possible historical legacy of the likes of Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, and the Ayatollah could include helping the US Navy lose enough high-end skill that it was taken advantage of by China. I want to move on to firepower now, because this is both a big shortfall and also a huge opportunity for the Navy. Slide, please. This slide shows a range comparison between some Chinese anti-ship missiles versus the mainstay US anti-ship missiles. So when it comes to anti-ship missile firepower, the US military just really doesn't have that much. It has virtually no anti-ship missiles for its submarines, its bombers, or land-based forces. And also for the surface fleet too, which has a very small amount of anti-ship missile firepower, mostly in the form of only a couple Harpoon missiles on about half of all large surface combatants. When it comes to doctrine, even going back to the Cold War, the high-end skill sets of the surface fleet have mainly focused on anti-air warfare and anti-submarine warfare, and not so much on anti-surface warfare. On the other hand, the Chinese and the Russians do have extensive anti-ship missile firepower on their submarines, bombers, surface fleets, and land-based forces. Now, only within the past few years have we seen real progress on this. The US Navy is now on the verge of having a wholesomely armed naval force structure with large amounts of launch cell compatible missiles like LRASM, SM-6, and the Maritime Strike Tomahawk being only a couple years away. Finally, the US Navy will have widespread anti-ship weapons that can hit at over 100 miles. But this wholesome introduction of long-range anti-ship firepower is finally coming to the Navy after it was first proven possible a very long time ago. Compared to how the Russians have been fielding long-range anti-ship firepower across their force structure, the US Navy is more than half a century late to the game. Now, this recent introduction of long-range anti-ship firepower will not be the Navy's first attempt. There was an anti-ship Tomahawk in the 80s, and the submarine force had Harpoon before. But up until now, much of the Navy's story of fielding anti-ship missiles consists of developing weapons long after they were first possible, then not fielding them in effective numbers, taking them out of the inventory prematurely, only to then try and reintroduce them decades later. The Navy lagged long enough to where today there are 400-ton Chinese missile boats that carry more long-range anti-ship missile firepower than 9,500-ton billion-dollar American cruisers and destroyers that have around 100 launch cells. So why was the Navy stuck with only the short-range Harpoon missile for so long? And how did the Navy's first ever anti-ship missile remain its primary anti-ship weapon for more than 40 years? And why were competitors able to design so many more anti-ship missiles with greater lethality in the meantime? My theory looks to doctrine. The aircraft carrier has been the centerpiece of US Navy long-range anti-ship doctrine since World War II. Harpoon probably became the Navy's first anti-ship missile and remained its primary anti-ship weapon for so long because it looks like Harpoon was one of the very first anti-ship missiles that was small enough to fit onto a multi-role aircraft like those flown from carriers. By comparison, airborne anti-ship firepower for the Soviets mostly took the form of these enormous missiles that could only be carried by large bombers. Slide, please. These are Soviet anti-ship missiles, all of which predate Harpoon. But the small size necessary to equip carrier aircraft with Harpoon was a major limiting factor for capability when it comes to speed, range, and payload. Ship-launched missiles can take on far greater proportions like Tomahawk. But because the Navy chose to not field an anti-ship missile that was compatible with the thousands of launch cells across the fleet, the Navy didn't capitalize on core advantages that warships bring to the fight, including staying power and deep capacity. Slide, please. So this is what it looks like when the Navy fields a missile that is not compatible with its launch cells. And so it is questionable to subscribe to a doctrine that deprives the surface fleet, the submarine force, land-based forces, and bombers all of long-range anti-ship missile firepower. When it comes to anti-ship weapons in the age of missile warfare, not only did the Navy bet the aircraft carrier would dominate, but that it could stand alone. So while the reach and size of the carrier air wing could compensate for Harpoon's shortcomings, the rest of the fleet was stuck with a small, slow, short-range missile kept aboard in very low numbers. The US Navy was so completely focused on a single platform that it failed to effectively field the premier offensive weapon of a new age of warfare. And I want to go back to training for a moment. So when it comes to sinking ships at range, since World War II, the Navy has mostly focused on carrier aviation. But if you look at the Navy's training in the power projection era, there just wasn't much training being done when it comes to massed strike fighter attacks against high-end surface action groups. Most of the training of the strike fighter community has instead focused on air-to-ground and air-to-air missions. So when it comes to sinking ships with missiles at range, the Navy essentially bet everything on this one tactic. But it's a tactic that hasn't been effectively trained in perhaps decades. Now, even if the Navy was spending a lot of time on this tactic, the idea of sending concentrated carrier air power to attack groups of high-end warships with a short-range missile like Harpoon carries a lot of risk. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that here, but I spent a lot of time on that in part 3 of the article series, which looked at doctrine and tactics. Slide, please. Now, going back to weapons, the Navy's firepower is about to see a historic transformation in only a few short years. Comparing firepower using a strike mile metric, which is a version of warhead weight times range times number of weapons, this metric shows that putting LRASM into only 15% of the surface fleet's launch cells will increase its anti-ship missile firepower almost 20 times over what it has today with Harpoon. New anti-ship missiles will also cause the submarine community, the heavy bomber force, and land-based forces all to also have their own major transformations in offensive firepower. The widespread introduction of these new weapons will present the Navy with one of the most important force development missions in its history. This dramatic across-the-board increase in anti-ship firepower for all this untapped force structure could put the Navy on the cusp of a revolution in tactics unlike anything seen since the birth of the aircraft carrier a century ago. Now, does the Navy have a plan for seizing this force development opportunity? The next thing I want to go over is the relationship between the Navy's material condition and its warfighting ability. Slide, please. This slide shows how the majority of the Navy's recent maintenance availabilities went beyond schedule. So looking over the past 20 or so years of deployments, the fleet's operating tempo was unstable and unsustainable. Over and over again, the Navy was forced to compromise and improvise schedules just to make ends meet and maintain that deployment rate. Some ships already on deployment had their tours extended on short notice. Longer deployments created more maintenance demands. So I think we all kind of know the story of cascading problems at this point. And so what I want to do is tie that directly to warfighting, mainly by focusing on surge capacity. The state of the fleet's maintenance is a limiting factor of strategic consequence because it determines the Navy's ability to surge its forces on short notice. If the Navy has to suddenly surge in large numbers, it will have to make tough decisions on which ships it will bring forward and which ships it will leave behind. Major contingencies could easily force the Navy to pull units from beyond those that are in the so-called employable windows of the workup cycle. But at any given moment, many ships are undergoing deep maintenance and complex upgrades, which makes it more difficult to deploy them on short notice. And so we have to remember, in the aftermath of those collisions, the Navy's can-do culture was cited as a major factor in deploying ships in worsening condition for years. But how can-do will the Navy be when it really has to surge for a major crisis? And how much surge capacity has been lost to years of these long deployments and maintenance problems? Slide, please. So now compared to great power competitors, the United States has major military disadvantages when it comes to geography because it has to cross large oceans to surge to the front. Russia and China, by comparison, can easily enjoy steep advantages in timing, numbers, and distance because major contingencies are more likely to break out close to home for them. They have a major surge advantage. Now, surging is vital to winning the high-end fight because of how intense the combat can get. War at sea has always been especially deterministic when it comes to firepower overmatch because of the especially concentrated nature of naval capability. And this trend is really exacerbated in the missile age where now only one hit can easily be enough to put a ship out of action, meaning a very small advantage in firepower can quickly snowball into decisive effects. And so imagine how this could play out when modern war at sea can consist of forces unleashing salvos of dozens, if not hundreds of missiles at one another's ships, even within minutes. High-end naval combat could easily witness extreme amounts of rapid overkill if warship defenses fail to keep up even slightly. And so if I could paraphrase the late Captain Wayne Hughes for a moment, both history and theory have shown that a small advantage in force is often enough to be decisive in naval battles, and that the slightly inferior force can lose with very little to show for it. So when it comes to force development, force posture, and everything else you do to be ready for conflict, you can get so many things right. But at the end of the day, if you can't surge enough forces at the critical moment to tilt those missile exchanges in your favor, much of the fleet could be destroyed pretty quickly. And so it's important to never forget that, especially in a missile age, a fleet that is even slightly outgunned can easily lose. And you have to guard against that with surge capacity. It also means that you really have to make that extra effort to get your force development right in peacetime, because a modern high-end campaign could be over pretty quickly, and you just won't have much time to fix things or learn lessons in the middle of it. So when it came to how it managed its readiness in the power projection era, the Navy became really imaginative. It lowered key readiness standards, set extreme surge requirements, and made lengthy deployments that were once considered rare than new normal. The Navy launched major efforts to try and increase its presence in forward areas and also add more surge capacity from home. But these are two opposite ambitions for orienting readiness. The Navy tried to do both at the same time, and with a fleet that would shrink to half its size in 15 years. And so after pushing too hard for too long, the US Navy now finds itself tired, unbalanced, and less sure if it has either the forward presence or the surge capacity to stop great power war in its tracks. And so for my final section here, I want to bring it back home to the training and exercise question and how it relates to the profession of arms. Slide, please. So something important to understand about warfighters is that after spending an ungodly amount of time doing paperwork and attending sessions and conducting so many other preparations, warfighters crave the opportunity to do their job and put their skills to the test. They crave those experiences that allow them to employ advanced warfighting tools and tactics and to finally see how they would fare in a hard-fought crucible. But so much of the day-to-day duties of the profession of arms involves doing work that, while connected somehow to warfighting, is not warfighting itself. Now, this is not to say that all warfighters crave real combat or that they are eager for a chance to use lethal force against people. The point is that an organization focused on security faces unique challenges of promoting professional satisfaction and morale. Most other organizations exercise the main functions they were made for on a frequent, regular basis. But for an organization focused on security, however, until a real threat arrives, it has to remain in a self-imposed state of vigilance. And while as important as it may be to act as a sentry, it is maybe not the most professionally fulfilling experience for someone who provides security. And so an organization focused on security should conduct hard training, not only for the sake of preparedness, but to give its people opportunities to push their limits and enjoy the fulfillment of becoming a better professional. In the absence of a real threat that demands the immediate use of specialized skills, a focus on sharpening those skills is the next best thing. But heavily scripted combat exercises don't usually make for stimulating professional development. Scripted exercises inhibit the warfighter's ability to develop the unique professional skills critical to success in the battlefield. When we think of our ideal military leaders, we think of people who can manage the chaos of combat through open-minded thinking, the utmost candor, and a willingness to push to failure. But these traits hardly describe the character of heavily scripted training. And so when the primary format of combat training takes this form, warfighters are deprived of a valuable arena where they can prove themselves and showcase some of the most critical virtues of the profession of arms. Slide, please. And so everything I've said so far in each of these sections, it is all based on a singular theme that I think was best captured by CNO Admiral Hayward in the introduction to the first edition of Fleet Tactics by Captain Hughes, where he said, what is the naval profession about, if not tactics, tactics, and more tactics? And so if you understand warfighting tactics, and you know that the application and the development of tactics is the primary essence of the profession, then you will have a fundamental lens to focus your efforts. It will give shape to how you approach so many things the Navy is doing, whether it's preparing for a deployment, experimenting for future force structure, selecting people for command responsibilities and leadership positions. So much of what the Navy does boils down to connecting something to its tactical warfighting implications. And you may have heard a similar theme with Navy leaders sometimes saying everything boils down to lethality, but lethality is understood and applied through the art and science of tactics. And so I want to put a spotlight on a positive trend where the Surface Navy opened the Surface and Mine Warfighting Development Center about 5 or 6 years ago, the so-called Top Gun of the Surface Fleet, where this center is graduating these new warfare tactics instructors. You can see them there on the slide holding their new their graduate patches. And what these instructors are doing for the Surface Navy is leading a sea change. They are instituting a structured debriefing process, shepherding units through more advanced combat exercises, and developing new tactics and doctrine for the surface fleet as a whole. And one of the most important data points about this community of instructors is that their retention rate is double the historical average of the surface warfare community. And this proves a very important point about what Admiral Hayward was saying. When you expose warfighters to complex exercises, honest debriefs, and you engage them in the force development of the broader Navy, it can make a career in the profession of arms so much more fulfilling. Slide, please. And so to wrap it up, I would say much of the modern U.S. Navy story is that of an organization that was separated from what had long been its defining mission, which was high-end sea control. And when that separation occurred at the start of the power projection era, problems radiated throughout its institutions. Now the Navy is embarking on a tough transition back toward great power competition, which has been made all the more urgent by the rise of a rival maritime superpower. So thanks again for the opportunity. I hope you can read the articles on CIMSEC, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Jeff, you're on mute.
Well, as I transition from slide flipper here to moderator, let me catch up with any of the chat to see if there's any questions there. But let me start off with a couple. You paint what I think is a realistic picture of events that has occurred in the evolution of the Navy, constrained mainly by combatant commander demand with a swelling fleet and a higher demand. And this has been pointed out both in official reports, naval studies, and of course your own excellent articles. But in addition to the WITI program that's introduced by the Surface Navy, what other good news do you see that the Navy's emerging to try to address this problem?
So you are seeing a stronger focus on warfighting across the various communities. The Submarine Force has a new aggressor squadron that's doing a lot of good work for them. The Marines are doing a lot of very large-scale force-on-force exercises in the past few years. And so you're seeing a greater warfighting focus in the communities within the past few years, where they're kind of getting at a lot of the problems and so on, and a renewed focus on tactical development. One of the most important things I think that's happened is the introduction of the large-scale exercises that are coming up this summer. Because one of the things that's really holding the Navy back is not having enough forces on hand to do these exercises. Because as soon as Navy units are certified and ready to deploy, they go to the combatant commands. But what the experience of the Army and the Air Force show with their exercises is that the services themselves need ready forces to do high-scale exercises and focus on force development. And force development is the job of the services. It is not the job of combatant commanders. And so I would like to think that the large-scale exercises represent a sea change in that relationship, where there's going to be more ready naval power allocated toward the Navy to do these kinds of exercise events on a large scale. Well,
what you're asking or almost implying here is that the cost is, of course, to the combatant commander and the ready forces that we provide them. Is there any alternative to actually providing these force development exercises outside of near CONUS, so that the forces, as they develop these exercises, are actually operating in an AOR and a different combat commander's AOR?
So I guess one thing you can do is that it doesn't have to always be live exercises. Simulators can go a long way. It's traditionally been an area of underinvestment for certain communities to have those simulators. And of course, it's not enough to just have the simulators. It is to give sailors enough time to use them and have repeat attempts. And also, it is a major kind of ask to take ready naval power away from the combatant commanders and put it toward a different priority. I wouldn't blame the combatant commanders for asking for that ready naval power, because I think it's their job. It's their job to mitigate geopolitical risk through forward operations. Just the way their duties are outlined and their incentives are lined up. We can't fault them for setting those demand signals. I think if there is to be fault, it is at a level higher than the service chiefs and the combatant commanders, or the Secretary of Defense plays a major role in allocating forces. And so I feel like at that level, this is where this kind of thing needs to happen. And also, there's a lot of exercises with partners and so on, but the risk of being surveilled, of the fear over sharing classified information, and how that limits the Navy's ability to really go all out in forward areas, I think that needs to be handled in a better way, because, yes, there is a resource shortfall in terms of how many ships you can have, but you have all these allied navies that can play a role. You can use allied navies as opposition forces. You can involve them in a greater force development experimental agenda. You can ask them to handle certain kinds of questions and problems, and you can all kind of work together toward the same operational concepts. But that would involve a level of integration, of trust, of access to classified information that I don't think has been the norm for a while.
Well, let me ask you another question. You've indicated some positive trends that we are actually moving in the right direction. How long do you think it'll be before we get to that ideal state?
I would say it's definitely a long-term effort. I would say it's probably in the range of maybe 10, 15, 20 years if we wanted to have a Navy that was really, well-versed and high in warfighting concepts, because remember, it took maybe 10, 15, 20 years for it to kind of pivot all the way to power projection after the Cold War ended and become very good at those other missions. And so you have to think about, the Navy needs to look at its warfighting concepts and look at it with the same sort of time frame as like a major program of record. It's about 15 or so years from the idea that you need a new warship toward actually launching the first in class of that warship into the water. And a warfighting concept is going to take a similar amount of time, because you have to do a lot of robust live experimentation to work some things out, and that's going to take years. And it's also going to take years, once you figure those questions out, it's going to take years to effectively train the force and make that deeply embedded expertise at the deck plate level. And so the Navy needs to pick a warfighting concept and commit. It needs to commit for the long haul. You look at ForceNet battle or ForceNet and Air Sea battle. There was a lot of good work that happened with that in terms of wargaming and simulation, but it only went for a couple years. If you're going to kind of have if you're going to turn warfighting concept development from having a lot of motion and turning that motion into traction, you're going to have to connect it to training, and training people up in a whole new thing they've never done before is going to take a long time. And that's a major decider in terms of how long this is going to take.
Well, speaking of time and capabilities, you indicated that our new systems that are coming online to give us longer range surface-to-surface missile capability, i.e. we're starting to enter the missile age, that we need to start make impactful force development exercises to know how to utilize those. But as you also pointed out, our adversaries, China and Russia, have had these capabilities for some time and trained to them. Are we playing catch up in the force development area here so that we're not prepared to take them on yet in this arena?
I think there is some truth to that, because China, for example, I think something that's sort of seen as a culminating event in China's force development history was the Taiwan Strait crisis in the late 90s that made them painfully insecure about U.S. naval power projection, where U.S. naval carriers were deployed to the region to deter China from intimidating Taiwan during democratic elections. And so that has been a major focus of them for 20 years. And thinking about how to defend against an American naval intervention against Taiwan, that has been a major scenario at the forefront of Chinese force planning and force development for 20 or so years. So I think there is an element of catch up to be played here. And also just the rate of if you want to put some reps and sets figures to it, if the Chinese Navy is completely focused on force development and they don't have to worry about forward presence in the Middle East or something like that, I mean, how often are Chinese warships deploying, and what percentage of those warships are engaging in sort of high-end force development? And so the amount of reps and sets that they do on an annual basis is probably higher in this kind of high-end combat exercise in the U.S. Navy. And so, I said it's going to take maybe 15 or 20 years to maybe get to a really good place with this kind of thing. But, the more combat exercises you could do, for example, as just one unit of measurement, the faster you can scale it up, the more frequent you can do them, the faster you can close that gap. And I also think it was very helpful for you to point out that, they've had the missiles for decades and they've trained to them. And something that the U.S. Navy is not terribly good at, from my understanding, is that you can field lots of new high-end capabilities, but what about the rest of the pipeline? You know, it is not enough just to give sailors new capabilities. You have to train them to know how to use them. You have to give them, do the sailors understand the tactical and the doctrinal implications of those new capabilities? And that does not end as soon as they have that, you know, deployed on the ship, or that they have a tactical menu. They need to be given the sense to use the capabilities and refine their intuition along the lines of how those things could be used in a situation.
It will be interesting to see how the Belt and Road Initiative that China has, extending its trade through the Indian Ocean, might increase the demand for deployments for China and decrease what you're talking about. But I don't want to address that now because we've got lots of great questions in the chat, and I'm going to throw a few out here. Here's one. If war games reveal gaps and offer low-risk opportunities to lose and learn, but training exercises apparently do not, where is the breakdown in communication between the war game outputs and the exercise inputs?
I would say that, you know, wargaming is something that should be made more available, simply because it's something that can mitigate the training problems and also compensate for just not having enough ready naval ships. But in terms of the connection between them, I would say that, like, for example, the implications of a war game, if a war game is being drawn up and there are tactics and operations being used or being assumed, and it's just not something people in the fleet know how to do, that is a major limiting factor. And so how does a war game translate the level of proficiency into the assumptions, the ground level assumptions that are used in designing that war game? And also, there is also a disconnect, because a major factor of war games is that, or a major strong point of war games supposedly is exercising human decision making. How do people think through problems? How do they react to things? And how do they process an evolving combat situation? But the thing is that in modern conflict, decision making it's digital, it's networked. It is all these, you know, electronic warfare and cyber and all these things. And those kinds of very complicated network dynamics are very difficult, if not outright impossible, for a war game to accurately simulate. And so what you would need an exercise to do to complement a wargaming effort is to work out the nature of tactical dynamics in terms of how someone would defend or attack your networks, and how they attack your decision-making capability in detail, and learn the specifics of how that would work. And through that, the exercises can discover things that the war games cannot, and it would be used to refine the war games. Because this is the critical relationship between exercises and simulations and war games, is that exercises are capable of discovering tactical ground truth that lies within the seams of simulation. Simulations and war games make assumptions about all kinds of things, and exercises can test those assumptions.
Sounds like what you're proposing is a very strong relationship between every exercise designer must first war game that design before it's executed, and then vice versa afterwards. Let me throw another question at you. This is from a veteran. When I was in the Navy, the composition of our air wings reflected a much broader focus than they do now. Does the Navy plan to address the lack of a beyond visual range air-to-air missile capability, such as the AIM-260, which is in development, to be able to keep adversaries at sufficient standoff range? So essentially, this question is, are we prepared, or is our air wing prepared to integrate a new beyond visual range air-to-air missile similar to the surface long-range missile capabilities? And if not, how are we going to keep these threats away from both high-value units and our ships?
So I'm not terribly familiar with the upcoming air-to-air missiles that are in the pipeline for that specific air-to-air combat scenario. I'm not terribly familiar with those kinds of capabilities that are in the works. I will say, tactically, in terms of the tactics you can use to address those problems, there needs to be a better relationship between the air wing and the surface Navy in terms of coordinating the anti-air warfare situation. And I would say that, you know, a major problem with how things have worked in the past few decades is that the communities have been divided from each other. You know, when you look at a workup cycle, most of the communities kind of work in doing individual unit level training. That's the vast majority of the workup cycle. And then they only integrate for a couple of weeks for things like COM2X. And then when they arrive on station, the strike group would often disaggregate. And so the level of coordination between the communities is a major thing that needs to happen if you're going to make these network-centric concepts become a reality, because all these network-centric concepts involve these units doing cross-domain fires and sharing sensor information. If they don't have a good understanding of one another's tactics and doctrine, then they're not going to be able to make a lot of these warfighting concepts happen the way you would want them to. And to something that gets a little bit more to your question, something that I talked about in the part 3 of my series on tactics and doctrine, I think if the air wing was focused primarily on air-to-air warfare and shooting down anti-ship missiles and focusing on flexing the network of the fleet and less so of going far forward and striking ships, I think that would be a much better role for them to take. And you would focus the surface Navy more on anti-surface warfare and put them a little bit more forward compared to playing a defensive role close to the carrier. And I think that sort of tactical disposition and focus could do a lot to answer to address the shortfall that you're pointing out.
Okay, here's another question for you. How impactful has the long-standing conflict between combatant commander demand signal versus Navy unique force development been in this issue? So essentially, where do you think that combatant command signal started to affect our ability for realistic force development type exercise?
I would probably say somewhere in the early 2000s, maybe when the Navy was kind of crossing towards that below 300 ships type of fleet size. I mean, the Navy was doing the large scale exercises that I sort of had in mind toward the end of the Cold War, when it was close to having that 600 ship Navy. And so that was something that was sort of the purview of the fleet commanders. And you're talking about combatant commanders in the services. It's kind of a unique construct, the way the Navy has to do it, because at a level below a fleet commander, you have the type commanders who do a lot of the training, but just for the communities. But the next person up is a fleet commander, who is the only person who can really have the responsibility to integrate the communities for fleet level combat exercises. But a fleet commander lies within the operational chain of command going up to the combatant commander. And so the fleet commander is sort of lying in this area where they're the only ones that are really able to do these kinds of exercises, but mainly their job has been to feed COCOM demand. Pacific Fleet has been able to do these fleet battle problems in the early years under Admiral Swift. And he made a good point in his article where he said that, that Pacific Fleet is both a consumer and a generator of readiness. It is a dual-hatted type of command. And so they owned the units, and they didn't have to ask anyone permission to basically have a red force and to conduct these kinds of exercises. And so it's really at the role of the fleet commanders to do the exercises and try to make them happen. And also, I would say, going several levels above, it's probably the role of the Secretary of Defense, who adjudicates this sort of force generation, this force allocation process, to realize that there is a mismatch between the force development risk that is being accounted for through the Navy's exercises and what the Army and the Air Force are doing through things like Red Flag and the NTC. The Navy has just been operating under a completely different model, and it deserves to have its own pool of ready naval power for its own force development.
Great response. And of course, we could even expand that to the joint forces as well, in the sense that the Navy communities have an issue with integration, then of course we have a much greater one when we start to address the joint fight. Well, here's a Marine Corps question. The Marine Corps has been on perpetual 1-to-2 deployment to dwell ratio long after the OIF and OEF drawdowns, because the Commandant knew he had to show significant utility, constant, low order, but high profile global operations in order to garner congressional support at the expense of preparing for high order threats. If you're not wearing out your forces, you're not getting resources to modernize, which you can't do because everyone is deployed. Any thoughts on how we find that short-term, long-term balance, and thoughts on exercising new concepts and our capabilities in an era where persistent global surveillance by our adversaries is a real possibility.
So there's a couple questions there. I will say that you know, there is definitely something to be said about the press of constant high operational tempo and having that being used as a way to demonstrate relevance. You know, I've heard arguments that the Navy's press for forward presence and maintaining a lot of continuous presence in the Gulf, it was something that would buttress its force structure arguments in the Pentagon and try to ensure that, you know, the fleet wouldn't shrink too slow or become too small. And the thing to understand is that, you know, force development, it gets kind of, you know, it doesn't get appreciated enough in these kinds of conversations in terms of being a major contributor to the forces, the services kind of justifying themselves. And I just think that, you know, the forward operations, they help and they are high visibility, but like the kind of work, the kind of learning that happens at a national training center or a fleet battle problem or a red flag exercise, it is something that everybody really needs to be keyed into, whether it's Congress, whether it's, you know, whether it's folks at MPS or elsewhere. The amount of learning value that comes out of those exercise events is tremendous. And by the way, that is another area to kind of deal with the resource shortfall. If you don't have enough ships, everyone needs to be paying attention to the insights that are coming from these exercises because they're such a trailblazing type of event right now for the Navy. And the training audience, confining the lessons learned to the training audience is not going to cut it. More people need to be keyed into it than just the immediate people who participated in the exercise. Now, with regard to the surveillance question, you know, I'm not sure how much they can learn from exercises or so on in terms of, you know, watching them through satellites or other means. But I will say that, you know, there is a deterrent effect there. If they are watching you going all out in exercises and pulling off some pretty sophisticated maneuvers, that could have a deterring effect on an adversary if they are watching that. And yeah, it does provide an opportunity for them to possibly learn something or to develop some counters. But you also have to think on the flip side. You know, if they are watching the whole time, and the Chinese and the Russians have been watching the US Navy doing scripted exercises for all these years, has that helped the deterrence value of those forces at all? And also, I would say that, you know, when you think of surveillance, persistent surveillance, I think we need to really think about the cyber equation and what it's really done. You know, the amount of cyber attacks and cyber hacks that have happened is pretty remarkable. I mean, they've stolen, you know, they've stolen Aegis, they've stolen the F-35, they've stolen electronic warfare libraries from the submarine community. And these are just the things I know through open source. And so the point with that is that the level of transparency because of cyber in the modern age, it's kind of, we have to get used to the new normal. And, you know, so the chance that they will learn something through an exercise, that they will probably be able to hack their way through in some respect, it's probably not that big of something to disclose at this point relative to that. And I also will make the point that, you know, even if they are able to learn something from spying on you or whatever, something that they cannot hack or steal is the skill of the warfighter. And that is an investment worth balancing against those risks.
It's interesting that you bring up this point. I'm purposely not identifying people's questions, but I'm going to on this one because he's an old carrier mate of mine, Sam Tangretti, who's now War College faculty and, of course, the director of the Future Warfare Studies Institute there. But he brings up this point. He asks this question on the deterrence value of these exercises. He says, would you think about COCOMs being required to conduct these high-end exercises by the forces in their theater? Much of what the forces are supposed to do in theater is deter war, just as you brought up. So wouldn't it make sense to demonstrate these high-end capabilities in regional exercises? Wouldn't that be the best deterrent?
I think it would be in some way. It has to be selectively chosen. Of course, there has to be some discretion exercised toward that. And so, yeah, there's definitely deterrent value in showing off that you can handle yourself against a hard-hitting opposition force in full view of an adversary. You know, there's a lot of value in that. And so it's something that you should definitely do with allies as much as possible to show that the allies themselves are capable, because the allies are far more likely to be the first in the fight because they're so close to the conflict when it could start in forward areas. And so I would say there's definitely a lot of value in that. And I think this concern over surveillance, I think it's perhaps gone a little too far on the Navy's part. I think there is some room for flexibility there that's not being appreciated. And also, I would say that I made an argument in my remarks that just through open source Office of Naval Intelligence reporting on the Chinese Navy, that they've been doing pretty sophisticated combat exercises for a while. And the people at the Office of Naval Intelligence know this, and they watch this, and they pay attention to it. But and they do their exercises in full view of the United States. We are paying attention, and that doesn't deter them. And at the same time, if there is so much to learn from watching your opponent's combat exercises, are people in the Navy writ large paying attention to that intelligence that the Office of Naval Intelligence is collecting on Chinese combat exercising? Because if it is if it is something of so much concern, then we should be seeing what our adversaries are doing and what kinds of crucibles that they're putting their people through. And they're not afraid of doing it in full view of surveillance.
That's an excellent intelligence observation as far as using that. In fact, this is a related question. How would you suggest that we solve the lessons learned versus lessons observed problem?
What is that distinction, if you could help me with that a little bit?
Dr. Vogler, I'm going to ask you to come online to, I'm not going to try to second guess you on this one. I'm thinking the lessons learned are what we file away in files, and lessons observed are what we're seeing other people are actually seeing that exercise itself. So Dr. Vogler, can you expand on that?
Sure. While we claim that we have a lot of lessons learned, because of the high tempo of observations, the high tempo of operations, basically we just observe that we encountered some difficulties in an exercise and then move on to the next problem. Are there any organizational or personnel changes that you would recommend to address this issue?
Yeah, I would say, I'm not in the Navy, so I don't know this firsthand, but most people I've spoken to tell me that the Navy's lessons learned system has a lot of room for improvement. And it's difficult. There's lots of files and publications and paperwork and so on, but how do you actually get people to focus on it in like a sustained kind of way? And, as you brought up that, there can be lessons learned and observations and someone can draft a report, but that might come weeks or months after the exercise is finished or whatever has finished. And by then the training audience has basically moved on to something else. Right. And so I would say a major thing that needs to happen is a reduction of certifications and also of forward exercises. Basically, there's too much presence on the operational side, and there's too many certifications on the force generation side. And these things are depriving the Navy of having enough time to really do in-depth events. And for example, what you would spend that time doing is, in advance of an exercise, you could plan in advance. You could review relevant publications and tactical documents. You could watch replays of people doing similar events. And then after the exercise, you can watch your replays, you can conduct your debriefing, you can process the lessons. And then after that, you could go back out there and do a rinse and repeat, another attempt at the exercise. But the thing is that every single one of those things costs more time, and time is not something sailors often have. And so if you want to have more thorough events, you're going to have fewer of them to make more time for the few that you've concentrate on.
This is sort of another catch-22 question, because it's a good one. It has to do with fleet size versus lessons learned. So let me go ahead and read it. This is from the perspective of the submarine fleet, and specifically the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance mission set that they provide. To what degree can operational presence be throttled down to allow for better exercises before our lessened understanding of adversary capabilities and tactics affects that same simulation and training, especially as shipbuilding continues to lag the decommissioning of ships? Meaning that as our forces get smaller, those that actually collect the intelligence on adversary capabilities, they need to, if we start pulling them from collecting those capabilities, how does that balance against learning to fight against those capabilities?
That's a very important point. I will say that, I've been trying to track as much as I can through open source about what the submarine community has been doing the past few years as far as high-end force-on-force training. And they've been making some solid gains, it looks like. And I think for the submarine community, ISR operations is their story of too much forward presence. Well, the surface Navy and the carrier fleet was worried about too much forward presence. We're breaking the force. We're focusing on these low end missions. The submarine force's corollary story is that they were being sent forward to do pretty much ISR missions. And so that is their equivalent of that. And so I think, there's a lot of intelligence being collected, sure, but I think you can probably afford to scale that back some. And I think you kind of have to scale that back some if you're going to make time for these force-on-force events. And it's interesting because the submarine community seems to be one of the first communities that really was able to carve some time out for themselves to do more of these events and establish an aggressor squadron, for example, was a big step they took. And it's interesting what that would look like from the combatant commander's perspective. Did the submarine force, did the Navy have to fight that really hard? Were the combatant commanders wanting that intelligence as bad as they were? There's probably a conversation there. But a main theme is that, the Navy's been conducting a specific set of operations for 20 or 30 years. And I described the need for these exercises as a blind spot, as a demand signal that was not being met, and it was a major demand signal. And so if you're going to account for that major demand signal, it is going to have to come at the expense of the things that we are used to doing for decades. And that's going to be difficult. There's going to be some tension there. It's going to take some getting used to. And so as we kind of balance the trade-offs there, ask the submariners on the deck plate, how do you feel about the ISR missions versus how much did you get out of a force-on-force event? And see if they can kind of understand the impact of that. And I think if you talk to people on the deck plate who have gone through these new events, they will tell you it's some of the best training they've ever had in their careers and that they want to keep doing it all the time.
You said, here's another question. You said the Navy needs to commit to a concept. By the way, I like this question a lot, so I'll be interested in how you answer. Has the Navy committed to distributed maritime operations? Why or why not? And what would commitment to concept look like?
Can you say the first part of the question again, just so I got it?
Sure. You said that the Navy needs to commit to a concept. Has the Navy committed to distributed maritime operations?
Okay.
What?
Yep. So I'm still a little bit hesitant to say if it has committed. I will say that it does span the tenure of 2 CNOs, so that does seem like there is some sort of commitment happening. But it's hard to stress. I can't overemphasize enough how, it's still very, very, very early in the concept development for things like distributed maritime operations. There's been a lot of simulations. There's been a lot of wargaming that's gone into it. But in terms of taking that extra most important step of taking it to sea and actually training sailors how to do it and figuring out the nuts and bolts of the tactical implications, the specific tactical techniques that make up that operational concept, we are only just getting started. And so it is going to take a long time. That is kind of what I had in mind in terms of 15 to 20 years to figure out DMO. And I would define commitment as taking it to sea and trying it out and making sure it has a major impact on the training regime of the deck plate sailor. When I see warfighting concepts, being touted in program presentations and so on, and I'm seeing them, being discussed in certain high-level discourses and so on. It's hard to see. It's hard to know if this is something that's going to be turned into something that changes the know-how of the deck plate sailor versus is this a concept to support some sort of budgetary argument or programmatic argument. And I think one way to tell is that if a warfighting concept comes and goes in a couple of years, it's safe to say that the deck plate sailor is probably not familiar with it.
Well, I'm going to ask a follow-on question for myself before I go on to the next one, because it's related to this. Do you feel that the fleet's current architecture could support distributed maritime operations? Distributed maritime operations was a concept developed due to adversary capability. Do we need to think about a different fleet architecture in order to actually execute DMO?
I would say so. I mean, the force structure of the fleet, because it takes so long to build a ship and it takes so long to build out an entire class of ships, I mean, that's a decades-long process. The fleet that we have today was optimized for the late Cold War. That is the fleet that we have today. It was optimized for great power competition. warfighting. And a lot has changed since then, and we do definitely need a different fleet architecture. But I don't know exactly what the answers are. I'm sure there's some sort of unmanned component. I'm sure there's some sort of, mine warfare component, which has been sort of underappreciated. But I hesitate to give definitive answers in terms of specific platforms and specific types of force structure because, we have to try these things out at sea to figure that out. We've done a lot of wargaming and so on. When you see these fleet warfighting or these new force structure concepts coming out, they're not the progress. They are not the product of a rigorous series of at-sea combat trials. In part 7 of my series, I talked about this, and there was a great little story there from Captain Hughes where he talked about taking a ship out to sea to test concepts for the sea control ship. And he talked about how frustrating the experience was because the person in charge of that didn't realize that his job was to develop new tactics to figure out if this new ship would work or not. And so there's something to be said of of using modern ships to experiment for future force structure. And so I'm hesitant to set my foot down on specific platform choices until we've really done that kind of experimentation.
Great. Let me ask this question, and you addressed this somewhat, but you probably want to reinforce this observation. So the interwar fleet problems were particularly effective because the majority of the fleet participated. We cannot do that today due to overseas commitments. However, modern commercial wargaming capability might allow fleet-wide participation in problems. This might go far into solving the lessons observed versus lesson learned problem. What are your thoughts on this?
I think, every squadron, every ship in the Navy should have some sort of wargaming capability on the deck plate level, even if it's something rudimentary. Because I understand that it's probably a tough ask to ask everyone to do loads and loads of high-end combat exercises all the time with real ships. Or to have like a lot of time in like a very sophisticated simulator. But you don't need that kind of high-end experience to exercise your tactical intuition and your decision making and dealing with improvisation and understanding, how to apply combat intuition and so on. And so wargaming, in terms of something to make warfighting practice much more mainstream in the Navy, it definitely needs to be heavily invested in as a line of effort. But I will say is that it should not go too far. We should not think it can learn things that it cannot be learned, in the sense that there is a specific quality to going to sea in a real ship and commanding real sailors and hearing live missiles shoot off a ship. There is real value in that. And there is something to be said also in terms of the kind of learning you can do in terms of technical things. A war game can certainly teach you some sort of concepts and some sort of tactical know-how, but when you go to sea with real ships and planes and you're trying to go through an exercise and you're encountering glitches in your networks and your communications, that is an extremely valuable thing to discover and pass that on to the institutions like SMITIC and elsewhere to work out those kinks. And so besides the specific training value for the warfighter, there are force development questions that can only be understood by trying things out in the real world with real platforms.
Well, Dmitry, I've saved this last, it's not a question, it's a comment, but I've saved it for last on purpose because it leads into my thank you for your presentation today, both to the CIMSEC community and to the Naval Warfare Studies Institute community. But it says this: I am a civilian, never been in the armed forces. This was extremely well presented, and I am proud that we have people such as you and a government where we can say this. Thank you. And Dmitry, thank you very much for your participation today. We look forward to future opportunities to partner with CIMSEC on presentations and writing events. And for those who participated today, thank you very much for your participation, your comments, and your questions. And now, of course, we need to head toward action on all these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you.